Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the fascinating mechanics of the Bay'ah. This is the historic legal contract that literally united millions of people under a single political institution. And I'm so thrilled to guide you through this because honestly, the sheer scale and the structure of this agreement is just mind-blowing when you look at it through the lens of institutional design. So let's just jump right in.
I want you to just think about this for a second. Imagine the monumental, logistical nightmare of getting millions of citizens to agree to a singular, binding political contract, and doing it entirely without modern technology. No internet, no smartphones, spread across vast geographic landscapes. How on earth does a state actually pull that off while maintaining absolute legal legitimacy?
Well, to answer that, we're going to look at 6 specific institutional layers today. First, what is the Bay'ah? Then the Islamic ruling system, the anatomy of the contract, a one-to-millions agreement, what happened when the system fractured, and finally, the modern legacy.
Starting off with Section 1, what is the Bay'ah? Defining the contract of citizenship. Now, before we even define the word itself, we've got to ask a much bigger question. How does any state actually legitimize its power? Right at the core of every stable civilization is this concept of legitimacy in governance. And the Islamic system answered this question of state authority not through some vague divine right, but through a very specific legally binding mechanism. And that mechanism is the Bay'ah. What's really fascinating here is that the Bay'ah is not a spiritual pledge. It's a hard, tangible ruling contract. It clearly defines the relationship between the people, the ummah, and the state. For anybody living under this authority, the Bay'ah is effectively their citizenship contract with the ruler, the Khaleefah. And the absolute most vital ingredient? Mutual consent. The people choose to be ruled, and the ruler accepts the specific conditions of ruling. If that contract and its conditions are missing, the ruler literally has no legal authority.
Moving to Section 2, the Islamic ruling system, institutions over individuals. Okay, so here is a really crucial point. We have to separate the spiritual religion from the tangible state apparatus. The state institution itself is called the Khaleefah. It's a general leadership, a riyasha amma, that is designed specifically to implement the laws of Islam. The Khaleefah, he's simply the head of that state. His authority absolutely does not exist in a vacuum. It entirely depends on that Bay'ah being present. No Bay'ah, no authority. It's an institutional role, not a personal entitlement.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how deeply ingrained this institutional separation is, going all the way back to the foundational days in Medina. The Prophet held 2 very distinct institutional roles. First, as a messenger, that carried infallible religious authority. But second, as a ruler, and that was an administrative, temporal authority that actually required a contract. The Bay'ah was taken specifically for this ruling role, not as some kind of pledge on religious belief. It really proves that the head of the state succeeds the administrative temporal leadership, not the prophetic infallible one.
Section 3, anatomy of the contract, the language of law.
To really grasp how this agreement was legally structured, we have to look at the language. Classical historians summarize this perfectly. Ibn Khaldun noted that the Bay'ah, quote, was considered to be something like the action of buyer and seller. Therefore, the oath of allegiance was called Bay'ah, the infinitive of ba'a, to sell or buy, end quote. I mean, think about that. The root word literally means commerce. It mimics a commercial transaction. The citizens trade their obedience, and in exchange, the ruler provides governance and execution of the law. It's a straightforward civic transaction, effectively sealed with a handshake.
But, as we know, words matter. And over time, shifting words completely altered legal realities. Originally, the Bay'ah was a true contract of consent, known as an aqd. But later in history, we start seeing the rise of the ahd, which is a succession contract. This later invention basically governed who would be the next ruler. It shifted the whole system away from pure, present-moment consent to a prearranged succession. Understanding that difference between a true contract of consent and a succession decree is absolutely key to understanding the institutional history here.
Which brings us to Section 4, a one-to-millions agreement, the mechanics of consent.
So let's look at how this builds into a solution for that massive logistical nightmare I brought up earlier. How do you practically execute a contract between one ruler and millions of everyday citizens? Well, you split it into 2 brilliant steps. Step 1 is the Bay'ah of contract. This is enacted by the representatives of the people, known as the Ahlul Halli wa Aqd, the people who loosen and bind. They officially contract the ruler. Then, step 2 is the Bay'ah of obedience. This is the public reaffirmation by the masses. You can kind of think of it like a modern couple renewing their marriage vows publicly. The legal contract is already signed by the representatives, but the public pledge confirms everyone's commitment to the ongoing relationship. And the parameters of this contract were incredibly strictly defined in classical law. Contracting the ruler is a fard al-kifaya, that's a collective obligation, meaning as long as the representatives do it, the duty is fulfilled for everyone. But the Bay'ah of obedience, that's a fard al-ain. It's an individual duty binding on every single person. And importantly, this contract was only taken from mature adults. It was entirely a civic action. We know this for a fact because historically children could accept the religion, but they were legally barred from giving the Bay'ah simply because they couldn't enter into a binding civic contract.
Section 5. When the system fractured. The shift from contract to monarchy.
So what happens when these strict contractual rules are institutionally misapplied? Well, the system breaks down. There's actually a famous prophetic text that warned of this exact institutional shift. It stated, the Khaleefah will be for 30 years, then it will become mulk or monarchy. Now, this wasn't a warning that the state would just vanish, but a warning about the institutional shift from a consent-based contract to a system marked by hereditary rule and the abuse of power.
And if we look at the timeline, we see this fracture play out systematically. Those first 30 years represented the pure consent-based contract. Then, the Umayyad era saw the shift into that hereditary monarchy, or mulk, utilizing those succession contracts rather than true immediate consent. By the late Abbasid era, the system fractured even further as the central institution lost actual executive power to regional sultans, which made the contract legally defective. And then finally, on March 3, 1924, the institution itself was entirely abolished.
Which brings us to our final section today, the modern legacy, the missing contract.
The abolition of the Khilafah in 1924 sent massive shockwaves across the global Muslim world. It left behind this unprecedented institutional void. Suddenly, intense intellectual debates erupted everywhere. Some people questioned if a state was even necessary anymore, while Western Orientalist scholars jumped in to critique the classical succession models. But despite all those turbulent debates, the overwhelming historical and scholarly consensus quickly reaffirmed one thing: a unified political authority and not ruling contract remained an absolute necessity for the Ummah.
And the primary reason for that solid consensus is the enduring legal textual evidence. The classical mandate states unequivocally, whoever dies while having no bay'ah on his neck, he dies the death of jahiliyyah. That is a profound text. It indicates that maintaining this civic contract is an ongoing collective obligation. It isn't just some piece of history to look back on, it is framed as a continuous, vital pillar of unity for the global community.
So, I really want to leave you with this thought today. We've seen how the Bay'ah functioned as this incredible mechanism of consent, uniting millions through a highly structured civic transaction. If this contract is truly an enduring obligation designed to bind a civilization together, what are the massive implications for the Ummah today, living in a world where this unifying global social contract is just entirely absent? It's a huge question, and one that definitely continues to echo through the modern world. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the institutional structures that shape our world.